Okay, wonderful. So, I'd like to say hello to everybody joining us here at the University of Bucharest at the Law School, and also to all those who are joining us online for what promises to be a very interesting conversation. And I want to emphasize from the very beginning that we have structured this event mostly as a conversation. In the Division of Labor, I'm going to be the moderator of this conversation and this event. I'm Paul Dragoș Aligică. I am a professor at the University of Bucharest, and I am associated in various capacities with the organizing entities behind this event. Now, most of you who are here came here mostly for the intellectual substance of this event. However, I would like to emphasize that there is also a different dimension of what is going on here. It's for the first time when we are opening a new line of events and a new line of conversations at the University of Bucharest and at the Center for the Study of Natural Law and Normative Analysis. Four institutional entities are behind this event: the University of Bucharest, the Faculty of Law at the University of Bucharest, the Center for the Study of Natural Law and Normative Analysis, again a University of Bucharest entity, and the Circle for Thomistic Studies, a new entity which has been just opened in the context of the academic and university life at Bucharest. Now, I have mentioned that this is a special event because we are starting a conversation with something which is very special, a special guest and a special topic. Most of you who are already familiar with our previous lines of events and conversations know that we have a special interest in the problem of secularization. We consider it to be an extraordinarily important problem, one of those neglected but crucial challenges, problems that helps us to understand the current conditions and, most interesting and most important, the trends and the direction in which modern society is going. So this is one of the contexts of this conversation, and we have with us guests, and we hope that this is just the beginning of a relationship between us and Father Ezra Sullivan, who is coming here from Rome, from Vatican, from Angelicum, and a little bit later in the conversation I'm going to ask him to say a couple of things about his institutional background. But for now I just want to give a tour and share with you who the other panelists are. And then next to Father Ezra is Professor Mircea Dumitru, a colleague of ours at the University of Bucharest, a philosopher and also the Vice President of the Romanian Academy of Arts and Sciences. And then next to him is Professor Radu Rizoiu, who he represents here at the table, not only the University of Bucharest, but also the Faculty of Law, who is one of our main institutional supporters in our attempt to open up these institutional lines and these conversations. Now, that being said, I'm going to present you the game plan. How are things going to happen in the next 1 hour and a half, maybe 1 hour and 45 minutes? Because we have decided, like in football, if things get interesting, we are going to get an extra time of 15 minutes, but not more. I know that Professor Stoica, who is with us here, wants me to be right in time, to start in time, to end on time, and I know that he's going to watch me closely and make sure that we'll be all of us out of here before 9. So rest assured, we have things under control, and if I losing somehow the track, Professor Stoica would be there and will make sure that we end before 9 p.m. So how are things going to proceed? I have already, I think, set up a little bit of the background of the conversation, but I'm going to ask Professor Rizoiu to say a little bit more in terms of a next step in understanding the setting of the conversation. Then I'm going to turn to Father Ezra, and I'm going to ask him a couple of things. Instead of me presenting a boring curriculum vitae or some semi-informed stuff about Angelicum or the Dominican order, I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit about that in his own words. And I asked him to do that before starting the conversation, and he agreed to do that. And then in function of the exchange between me and him, we are going to slowly move in the topic of his presentation, which is a secularization of the sources of morality. The presentation will take about 35 minutes, 40 minutes. We will see in function of how things shape up. And then we'll move to a comment, a reaction, and maybe a question or a set of questions from Professor Mircea Dumitru. From there, if Professor Rizoiu wants to add up, build up on that and ask a question, it will be his turn as a member of the panel. And then we open up the conversation to all those present. So this is the game plan. This is where we are. Hopefully things will be interesting, and we are trying to do them interesting. It would be a conversational mood, a conversational approach. And that being said, let's start and let's do it. Professor Rizoiu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Aligica. Welcome, everybody. Apparently, I am the welcoming party because I am the only one in this panel who is actually a professor here in the law school. So I would like to make a very short introduction about the place of this lecture within the temple of the law school today, this evening. So I will not speak on the sources of morality today. This is Father Ezra's task. But I will just try to make a link between the legal area, the legal field, and the need of a discussion on this topic. Because right now, it's a topic of first-year freshmen. What is the difference between law and morality? I think the discussion is a little bit more complicated. First of all, I am speaking here today only as a professor of civil law in the law school at the University of Bucharest and as a member of the Center for Studies on Natural Law and Normative Analysis. As someone who worked 4 years on putting together a new curriculum within the law school, I will only state that I am glad our school opens for pluridisciplinarity, because this was one of the themes for the new curriculum. And I received a lot of interesting reactions to that. And I welcome Friar Ezra Sullivan here, OP, for showing us a glimpse of the Dominican spirituality. I would like, however, to add a few words about another Dominican, and you shall see that our invitee is a true Thomist. I have to confess that among those theologians that I read, I feel more closely related to Thomas Aquinas, a prominent member of Ordo Predicatorum. Through St. Thomas, I discovered Aristotle in the same way the whole Western Christianity did 800 years ago. For an Orthodox, leaving Plato for Aristotle could look like treason, and my friends sometimes tease me for being too Aristotelic. I do believe we are now living in an Aristotelic world. And if you don't believe me, just read again the Nicomachean Ethics for convincing yourselves that almost all the Stagirite wrote almost 2,500 years ago holds true today. We are living for some time in an era of science. The Industrial Revolution showed us that the scientific progress could improve our living conditions. In the same time, just as predicted by André Malraux, our century searches for its spirituality, its soul. We see attacks against the sciences coming from all directions. The religions are attacking the modernist secularism and cry over the estrangement of man. The animists, now rebranded as ecologists, emphasize the self-destruction of the human habitat caused by modern technologies and preach the return to Mother Nature. The philosophers are wondering why there is so much advancement in hard sciences focused on the world, viewed outside the being, and so little progress or even regress is made in soft sciences focused on being in the world. The science seems to have advanced too much, and as in military strategy, it is now surrounded by adversary forces. Its flanks are under constant attack. The recent pandemic was just one litmus paper for this unseen battlefront. Today, everyone gives advice on what's good and what's bad, from the occultists to soccer players. And you might remember in the past 2 weeks in Romania, the lyrics of a song that made a lot of waves, Macarena by Erica Isaac, saying that some Mirel, a redneck from Turnu Măgurele, decided now to educate us. You've got problems. If we look only to 3 super specialties of medieval university, theology, medicine, and law, we see that there are more doctors and lawyers who believe themselves they have a divine power than clergymen. Referring to a celebrated quote, everything is relative. The situation was explained by Hannah Arendt in the middle of the last century, where she was lamenting about the falling of all 3 pillars of Western civilization: Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian faith. These sources lost all authority today, and the postmodern thought considers them outdated. Yet, the problem is not necessarily that of secular morality, but of multiplying moralities by inventing new religion. Malraux's catchphrase could be read today, like Nostradamus' predictions, in a new key. The religions multiplied themselves instead of being unified. The new religion lack any tradition. Even the traditional ones tend to become relative to entering into the politics. Islam derived the Middle Eastern Islamism. Orthodoxy has sometimes messianic surges like in today's Russia. Judaism developed a very conservative branch in Israel. Hinduism became increasingly intolerant in India, and so on. The law school risks finding itself teaching technicalities instead of values. Values remain to be taught only in philosophy and theology faculties. Today's event is a living proof that the law school tries to avoid this risk. Like St. Thomas, who considered theology could incorporate knowledge from other sciences, the law can and should relate to other areas of knowledge. The law tries to organize the world, and it cannot achieve this without knowing about the world. As Pope John Paul II once said, nobody studied the human being better than Dr. Humanitatis. Aquinas' celebrated studies on angels were done only in order to find the angelic part in us. Let's be, each of us, Thomists, at least for this evening. And I think now the scene is set for the presentation of the true Thomist in this room, the real one having a diploma, after all. And I will pass on back to Professor Ali Gica to make the formal introduction. Thank you.
Wonderful, excellent setting up the stage, Professor Rizzo. I really appreciate you helping us to make a step further in the direction of the conversation. Now, as promised, we are starting the conversation, and the conversation again will be set up like a sandwich. I'm starting with the exchange, then we smoothly turn towards the presentation, and then we extract ourselves from the presentation at one point and reopen up the dialogue. Now, you have, Professor Rizzo asked me to introduce you, Father Ezra, but I think that I have a better method to help all of us here be on the same page in understanding who our main speaker is today. Me asking you a couple of questions about your background, about your institutional background, and about your interest in issues related to moral psychology, theological psychology, philosophical moral philosophy, and things on those lines. So let me first of all ask you a question about your, what for us in the secular world is your institutional background. Angelicum, for us it's an awesome institution, one of the greatest institutions of learning in the world. Tell us a little bit more about that and how you got there as a professor.
First, I would like to thank everyone for having me here, especially the Faculty of Law, all of the organizers, and I would like to thank all of the panelists as well. The Angelicum is officially called the University of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's in Rome. and it is one of a very few universities in Rome accredited by the Holy See, the Vatican. We have our origins in the 1200s, actually with St. Thomas Aquinas as a teacher in Rome, who came from originally south of Italy near Naples, and eventually through the centuries it grew up into what is now our current home. We have 4 faculties, one of canon law, one of theology, philosophy, and one of the social sciences.
And you are associated with each of those?
And I am a professor in theology. I teach psychology in the philosophy faculty, and I'm currently working on my 2nd doctorate in canon law.
Oh, okay. So that's very interesting. And also you are a friar in the Dominican order, right? Is it the
Yes.
right way to put it?
Yes, so the Order of Preachers was founded in the 1200s by a Spaniard named St. Dominic, and so this is our habit. We wear this from the 1200s, and our monastery in Rome has 70 friars. Half are professors, half are student priests working toward their higher degrees.
Now, this might be a sensitive question, but usually you ask people about their career. In your case, it's a calling. Is it appropriate to ask you a question about your calling?
You can ask me anything. If I don't like it, I can change
Okay.
the answer.
Okay, so
About my calling.
yes, about your calling.
I come from a background that is not Catholic. I was raised as a Protestant, and my father and back 4 generations were all Protestant ministers. My family came originally from Ireland. They had the faith. They lost the Catholic faith 400 years ago, and eventually they settled in the United States, and this is where I grew up in California. When I was a freshman in university, I converted to Catholicism, and then as time went on, I became a Catholic, and then I entered the Dominican order.
Okay, now, you allowed me to ask you any kind of question.
Please.
So I'm going to ask the next question. I mean, there are 2 ways of asking the next question. So to be, let's say, the plain one, in which I'm simply asking why the Dominican order, not the Franciscan, not the Jesuits. The other way of asking the question is this: why people like myself love so much the Dominicans and are hating the Jesuits?
Well, okay, so in the Catholic Church, of course, there are lots of different orders, and each one has a different focus. Unlike a pure monastery, within the Catholic Church, the orders focus on some apostolic activity. The Franciscans, they help the poor. The Dominicans focus on study and preaching. And then there are lots of others. Some have education, some work in international relations. So for me, the Dominicans were very powerful because of this emphasis on study, preaching, but we also have a strong fraternal life. So we're semi-monastic. We're not fully in the world, we're not fully outside of the world. I think that helps us to understand this issue of secularization as well. Is it's not a rejection of the world, but it's also not a full embrace of it.
I see. So you avoided answering the second part of my question, why people like myself are hating the Jesuits these days.
I think that's for you to answer.
Well, okay, you've heard that. Okay, so now we have focused a little bit on your calling, but also you have like a specialization in the intellectual division of labor, which is mostly on issues related to morality. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And maybe at this point we could make the transition towards your presentation, why you are so interested in the relationship between secularization and morality.
My original doctoral research was under a Polish man, Wojciech Giertych, who's also a Dominican, and he is called the papal theologian. Everything that the Pope officially publishes, not sort of TV interviews or something like this, but officially publishes, he is the censor. He is the theological advisor of the Pope. Dominicans have had this position for 800 years. So he was my doctor father. And my research was on habituation. Habituation is the foundation of all virtue, according to Aristotle. But it's often overlooked because now it is seen as a purely psychological study. And so I wanted to unite the secular study of the psychology of habituation and then unite that with a virtue theory that could embrace a deeper understanding of justice as well as the operations of God within the soul. So my own work was trying to unite the natural and the theological sciences. And this is essentially one of my research interests, is to try to help to understand what value does natural reasoning have as an independent sphere, and then what reasoning can theology and divine revelation also offer, and how do they not compete but rather work harmoniously together.
And again, I'm going to go back to the issue of secularization and the topic of actually the main topic of our conversation. What would be the next step in connecting the general interest in the relationship between reason and revelation and the problem of secularization?
Well, secularization has a number of different definitions, some of which are very abstract. Charles Taylor discusses secularization as a disenchantment in the world and then a lack of practice of the Christian faith in the West. And yet, at the same time, my question would be, how do we understand secularization within an affirmation of the truths that are apprehendable by reason working on its own? So secularization, I would say, is positioned within a larger theological question about the nature of the world, the nature of God, and how does God interact with the world. So my presentation on secularization would begin by discussing the historical roots of where we find ourselves, and then we move into a sort of a Christian understanding of ethics. Shall I begin?
Absolutely. Let's move ahead, because I think that at this point we have a better understanding of where you are coming from with this, both in terms of your vocation and intellectual pursuits, and also in the context of the larger themes that are of interest to all of us who are joining today, both here and online. So let's move ahead.
To understand secularism, I suggest that we begin with the etymological and historical roots of the word saeculum. And here we look to Virgil's fourth Eclogue. He says this is my translation in English. He says, "The last age of Cumean prophetic song comes anew. The great temporal order is rebirthed. Now the Virgin returns. Now from on high a new progeny descends." With these mysterious and pregnant phrases, the Roman poet expresses what Christians eventually saw as a prophecy of Jesus Christ. Because of the coming of Christ, the pagan prophets cease to sing their song. He is born of the Virgin Mary. He is the eternal Son of the Father. He descends from heaven, and he inaugurates a novus ordo saeculorum, a great temporal order from the beginning. It's entirely fresh, entirely new, and it's the dawning of a new day. With the incarnation of Christ, there's a new way of understanding time and space. Previously, saeculum meant a 100-year interval between state-supervised spectacles, literally the secular games, that were held by the emperors as a manifestation of Roman extravagance. As the centuries wore on, even in the absence of the games, secular rhetoric highlighted emperors' establishment of new dynasties, and they wanted to show how the saeculum was ruled by man over this present age. And so they would even speak of a golden age of whichever emperor had power at the time. Once Christians were able to detach themselves sufficiently from this pagan Roman culture, they were able to reassert on a societal level another view of time, this one revealed in Christ. Christ is, as Scripture says, the Alpha and the Omega, the one who exists from all time, who makes all things new. St. Paul says that Christ gave himself to begin a new age away from the evil age in which we exist. So Christ delivers humanity from the temporality of this world, and he brings into this world a new moment. The ancient church fathers developed this concept even further. Without denying the natural goodness of the world, they also emphasized that without it, it languishes under the evil one, who is a slave driver. Christ sets us free from sin and death. And so they made a theological distinction between three periods of time. The first is the old saeculum, prior to Christ. The second is the new saeculum, the saeculum in which we exist from Christ's birth. And then the last is the saeculum saeculorum, the age of ages, the time without end. And this is why often prayers end, in Latin at least, in saeculum saeculorum. And so secularity becomes associated with this ritual paganism, with ludicrous games, the rule of power in the absence of Christ. The view of time and secularity was challenged by the sack of Rome in 410 under Alaric. The devastation and death that followed the Visigothic attack asked whether or not Christ was truly the master of time and space. Augustine of Hippo answered, and he said that Christ's reign, this saeculum with God's grace, is not so much a chronological reality, and it is not simply the emperor Constantine who rules over time and space, that we have to recognize that sin is still an element. The fallen world is still, as it were, not fully given itself up to Christ. And so secularity then takes on a character saying that secularity is an interior reality, and the goal of Christian culture is to harmonize divine reality with what we find in nature. So from this perspective, within this Christian worldview, secularity existed even prior to Christ. The Israelites, when they worshiped the golden calf, this is a version of secularity. Or when the prophets, they excoriated the secularity which called Israel back to true worship. And Christians have their own version of secularity when they abandon God. In the West, the church experienced such great secularity that the Pope leaves Rome for 70 years and rules from Avignon, France. And so then after him, there's secularity that leads to the Great Western Schism, 1378 to 1417. 3 different claimants to the papal throne, and this is the effect of their spiritual secularity. But what's different about modern secularity, this is the chief thesis offered by the church, is that there's a principled secularity that comes through these secular revolutions. In 1870, the bishops of the Catholic Church met in the Vatican, and they held a council. And the very beginning of this council, Vatican I, offered a dogmatic constitution on the Catholic faith called Dei Filius. The introduction offers a view or a historical theological understanding of the revolutions that came up to our age. And the quotations are on the handout. I won't quote them for you now. You can see them on your own, but I'll give you the shorter version. Essentially, what the Catholic Church started to recognize about these 3 revolutions was that they have a kind of degrading effect upon society because what's happening is a detachment from what was previously held in harmony. If in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas and his commentary on Aristotle represents a synthesis between faith and reason, what the Catholic Church started to recognize was that there is a slow separation between essential elements. In 1952, Pope Pius XII gave a speech which he summarized the world historical situation in the following way. He said, "In these last centuries, the enemy has tried to effect intellectual, moral, social disintegration from the mysterious organism of Christ. Here's the attempt to build a structure of the world on foundations which are principally responsible for the threat to humanity: an economy without God, a law without God, a politics without God, so that Christ is a stranger in the universities, in the school, in the family, in the administration of justice, in legislative activity, in the assembly of nations, and wherever war or peace is determined." According to the Pope, there were 3 stages of history up until 1952, and he described them in the following way. First, he said, came Christ, yes, the church, no. Second, God, yes, Christ, no. And finally, reason yes, God no. A continual negation. These correspond to 3 revolutions. Christ yes, the church no. This is the Protestant rejection of a universal, determinative, doctrinal source within the church. Next, God yes, Christ no. This is represented ideologically by the French Revolution's rational rejection of the central mysteries of Christianity, a pure deism. And finally, reason yes, God no. The Pope says, or rather, God is dead. God never existed. This is the atheistic revolution seen especially in communism. Finally, I would add a 4th revolution. And the 4th is, perhaps we can say the motto is, no church, no Christ, no God, no reason, only power and pleasure. And this is represented as the postmodern sexual revolution in 1968 or thereabouts. Now, for the purposes of time, I can't walk through each stage in all of its vast detail. In fact, this would be the source of an entire book. But what I can offer are just a few hints as to how this is manifested and how scholars have dealt with this issue. Scholars themselves not Catholic, entirely outside of the vision of a theological understanding, and yet nevertheless recognizing the schema somewhat offered by Vatican I and Pius XII. One work in this regard is by Professor Brad Gregory, who, with Harvard Press, offered a work that his title was called The Unintended Reformation: How a Religious Revolution Secularized Society. His thesis is the following: the Western world today is an extraordinarily complex, tangled product of rejections, retentions, and transformations of Western Christianity, in which the Reformation era constituted the critical watershed. Luther, in his tract to the Christian nobility of the German nation, 1520, he urged the aristocrats of Germany to revolt against the emperor as well as the pope. And he said to them that the state should no longer be informed by the teachings of bishops or the church. He said individuals, by their private judgment, can determine for themselves what to disbelieve or to believe. And he said that the hierarchical structure of the church, along with the sacrament of holy orders, was a fraud unworthy of obedience. Luther, I quote now, claimed a kind of infallibility for his own personal opinion. He said, "I am certain that my teaching came from heaven. My doctrines will stand, the Pope will fall." And he says, "I am certain that Christ himself calls me to be an evangelist, for he is the master of my gospel." Among the other elements we might notice, Thomas Aquinas would call the attitude inculcated here impiety toward the past, something referred to by another panelist as this sort of rejection of tradition, the iconoclastic smashing of the venerable statues of those which held together the harmony between faith and reason. James Simpson, in his book called Permanent Revolution, the Reformation and the Illiberal Roots of Liberalism, says this. He says, Protestantism is a powerfully and necessarily self-conflicted tradition because its anti-formalism repudiates tradition, and yet it contains within itself its own tradition of revolution. According to Simpson, one of the chief effects of the Protestant Revolution, in his words, was centralization of power. It's quite striking. He offers a theological justification for this, saying that the medieval view of God was that God was present in nature and allowed nature to operate by its own principles. But as soon as we say that nature is corrupt in its very self, irredeemable in such a way that it has no natural virtue, this is Luther's claim, he says, then what it requires is the strong hand of God to come in and to entirely shape nature in such a way that he almost acts like a tyrant. And very interestingly enough, this is precisely what happened under the Puritans after the Protestant movement begun by Henry VIII. Simpson lists signs of centralization and revolution by the Protestant secular state, including developing surveillance systems, legitimizing violent repudiation of the past, The saints were in position precisely to be set aside. He says that the Protestants of this time abolished calendars, martyrologies. They enacted cultural revolution. They repudiated what they said was an erroneous view by the ancient past that we have to overcome with our new progressive view. So he sums up his view, according to Simpson. He says, the key elements of modernity find their parallels rooted in the Protestantism, but they also find themselves growing again in revolutionary cultures, whether in France, Russia, China, or Cambodia. I quote him. He says, the fact that this typology of separate features can often be found together as a package shows that there is a comparative revolutionary historiography and sociology showing a theological instantiation of this package as a whole. According to Marx, he said that the radicalism of the German theory of revolution begins with the abolition of religion. Marx says, and I quote, he says, Germany's revolutionary past is theoretical. It is the Reformation. And that period of revolution originated in the brain of a monk, today in the brain of a philosopher. Luther, without question, overcame servitude through devotion, but only by substituting servitude through conviction. But if Protestantism was not the solution, it did at least pose the question correctly. That's Marx. I also have for you a quotation from Antonio Gramsci. As we know, he was an Italian communist who produced the idea that communism could be not merely an economic revolution, but also a deeper cultural revolution. Here's what Gramsci says, and it's worth quoting even though you have it on your paper. He says, because of its popular development, the Reformation was able to resist the armed assault of the Catholic coalition, and thus a new German nation was founded. A comparison can be drawn between this movement and the French political enlightenment that preceded and accompanied the Revolution of 1789. The latter, too, was an intellectual and moral reform of the French people. Renaissance, Reformation. German philosophy, French Revolution. Secular liberalism, historicism, modern philosophy, historical materialism. Historical materialism is the crowning point of the entire movement of intellectual and moral reform. It corresponds to Reformation plus French Revolution, university plus politics. Now, of course, Gramsci might be wrong, but it's fascinating to see that he agrees in this one case with the First Vatican Council and Pope Pius XII. Without getting into too much detail as well about the French Revolution, remember the motto here, according to the Pope, was Christ no, God yes. We see an emphasis on reason detached from divine revelation. Churches converted into temples of reason, in which the services were held to the cult of the supreme being, the cult of reason. The declaration of the rights of man and citizen were combined with the terror, in which the enemies of the people were declared to have no rights to defend themselves. And so what we see also in the revolutionary moment is both a repudiation of its immediate past, because the French Revolution did not accept a number of theological principles accepted by the Protestants, and yet it's also in a certain way a logical progression of a certain rejection of the past as a whole. And so there's a continuity as well as a discontinuity. According to Dale Van Clay, in his work, The Religious Origins of the French Revolution, he argues that the principles undergirding the revolution were derived in part from Calvinist theology, which rejected what it called the superstition and fanaticism of Catholic faith and morals. It rejected what it called clericalism, the practice of giving clergy a role in society, including politics. And the Calvinist theology in turn taught Catholics, who became Jansenists, to undermine respect for monarchy, aristocracy, and the episcopacy all alike. Here's what Van Clay says. He says, even in its most moderate phase, the French Revolution deprived the Catholic Church of the following. Now, this might sound familiar for those who know how the communist systems worked. He says it nationalized property. It took away the ability of the church to ask tithes. It ended corporate independence. It unilaterally redrew ecclesiastical boundaries. It abolished the regular clergy. He says during its more radical phases, revolutionaries imprisoned or massacred many clergy. They changed church names. They destroyed or defaced Christian iconography. They cut down towers. They melted down church bells. But of course, the French Revolution went beyond the iconoclasm of Luther, and it did things rather horrific. But it also set the stage for a later revolution. Now, here I should say that as myself having seen the fruits of a good Protestant upbringing, coming in California to be raised Christian at all was a great protection to morals, to faith. And yet, seeing how the calendars were changed, the saints were disappeared, you can also see an element of secularism. When we come to the Communist Revolution, because I don't have enough time to address this, and many in this room know much better than I do how it affected society, I'll just give a personal example. I remember when I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, and I was in my house all alone, and the lights were out. Parents were either sleeping or out of the house that day. It seemed like I was the only one awake. I turned on the television, and in those days, we didn't have, the infinite channels of mediocre entertainment. We had maybe 10 or 12, and I turned to the History Channel. Now, ordinarily, the History Channel it offered, the joke was it only offered two kinds of programming. One was about World War II, and the other was about the American Civil War. But this time, maybe it was because it was late at night, I saw information I had never heard of before, and actually had never formally been instructed about since, even in the university. And this told me about Stalin's reign in Russia. It described, there's a calm narrator describing millions of people going to their deaths, showing a face of the mustachioed Stalin, with onion domes in the background. And it described these gulags. I'd never even heard the word before, and the destruction of the human spirit that went there. For me, it was absolutely astonishing. No one had ever breathed a word about this. Everyone knew about how Hitler had killed trains full of Jews going off to concentration camps. But no one spoke, in the United States at least, about the terrors of the Communist Revolution. And so, as a teen, I began to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I began to want to understand this, to see face to face the concrete ways in which humanity could so undermine its own dignity. I remember writing to a ballerina. In those days, we didn't have email. And I was writing a girl, and I said, I'm reading this, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And she writes back, don't you think that's rather morbid? I felt like it was a moral duty to know what had happened. And so, let me just quote what Solzhenitsyn says in his Warning to the West, a series of talks he gave after he escaped the brutal prisons, and he came and received the Nobel Prize, and then eventually settled in the United States. He wrote this in the 1970s. He says, "It's astonishing that communism has been writing about itself in the most open way, in black and white, for 125 years. The Communist Manifesto, for instance, which everyone knows by name, and which almost no one takes the trouble to read, contains things more terrible than what has actually been done. It's perfectly amazing. The whole world can read, everyone is literate, and yet no one wants to understand. Humanity acts as if it does not understand what communism is, as if it does not want to understand, as if it is incapable of understanding." And so I could, if I wanted to, quote the manifesto of the Communist Party. I could talk about what they want to do, not only to abolish private property, but also the very family. They want to control education. They want to abolish countries, nationalities, borders. They want to wrest by degrees all capital from bourgeoisie and put it into a central committee. They want to centralize all property, to unite all means of communication and transport. But perhaps, most astonishingly, according to Lenin, they want to remove all ethics and morality. Here's what Lenin wrote. Is there such thing as a communist ethics? Is there such a thing as communist morality? Of course there is. We reject ethics and we reject morality in the sense given by the bourgeoisie, which is based on God and his commandments. On this point, we say that we do not believe in God. We reject any morality based on extra-human and extra-class concepts. I'll leave it to history to say where that leads. But the final revolution, perhaps, is even more astonishing in a certain way. The motto, no church, no Christ, no God, no reason, only power and pleasure. This followed directly from the communists. In the 1960s, Marxist theories followed Antonio Gramsci in shifting the discussion from economics to culture. And there were three sort of elements within the 1960s revolt. There's the youth culture, and we can see that the music, the clothing that starts to change. Hippies and dropouts, somewhat different. In San Francisco, California, near where I grew up, people were talking about flower power, Jimi Hendrix, use of drugs and free love. And then there were anarchists and open Marxists who rejected capitalism, but of course weren't workers themselves. They're students. They wanted politics and culture to change. They rejected the Vietnam War. They talked about black power. But they kept the same principle of Marx, namely to fight against whoever they named as the oppressor, and then to be on side of whoever they named as the victim. But in this case, now the paradigm has new dimensions. In the realm of religion, church hierarchy is called the oppressor, the laity the oppressed. In the realm of the sexes, men are called oppressors, women the oppressed. In the realm of races, whites are called oppressors, people of color the oppressed. And more recently, in the realm of sexual proclivity, heterosexuals are called oppressors, and others are called oppressed. And even more recently, in the past 10 years, 12 years, in the realm of genders, binaries, people identifying themselves as men or women are called oppressors, and transgenders are called oppressed. The world is now within postmodern neo-Marxism, and we can speak about the Frankfurt School, Maoist doctrines, we can speak about Michel Foucault. But there's another author that I think is valuable. Andrew Doyle wrote a book just last year called The New Puritans: How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. The Puritans were back at it again. But this time it's not a Puritanism based on belief in God. It's a belief in morals without God, without reason, without Christ or the church. And this is where we find ourselves now in the West, with an increasing tyranny that looks perhaps even more tyrannical than many liberal democracies. And with that, I'll give a brief, very brief conclusion about what an alternative might be. G.K. Chesterton summed up secularization in a phrase. He said, "Take away the supernatural, what remains is the unnatural." The ethics of Christianity is not a negation, it's an affirmation. The ethics of Christianity affirms the goodness of reason, the ability to know the natural law, to know the truth about the human person and the world. And this, John Paul II gave a great example. He said that faith and reason are like two wings on a bird that help it to fly. This affirmation will be of particular importance to the West, and not least in the United States, where discourse is reduced to power relations between people, where there's a breakdown of trust and mutual respect, in which people no longer even know how to speak about human nature, gender, or the proper relationship between the sexes. Next, the ethics of Christ affirm that faith and reason are not inimical to one another. They're not in competition for the obedience of men. Faith and reason operate harmoniously. We need not fear, as people of faith, science or philosophy, theology or law. These things can be harmonized with the mystical knowledge of God that comes from deep union in prayer, that find an intelligible harmony that emanates from God, who is the Logos itself. Third, the ethics of Christianity affirms the centrality of the incarnation, God made man, Christ revealed in the Gospels. Because God's word, through whom all things were made, sums up all intelligibility within himself. Christ is the goal of human history, the focal point of all desires in civilization. And this affirmation helps to respond to ethics that are quasi-Gnostic or New Age, relativistic views of salvation, what has been called moralistic therapeutic deism. And finally, the ethics of Christ, Christianity, also shows that the church has an irreplaceable role in salvation. And here I don't mean simply the Roman Catholic Church, but the church of the apostolic tradition. From the sacrament of baptisms, from the sacraments of marriage and holy orders, all the way to the sacrament of extreme unction before death, God gives grace to human beings to help us in ways that we cannot help ourselves. And this affirmation helps people who are disillusioned with the church, who are tempted to find their own way to Christ. It can encourage them to see God's hand in history, even working through imperfect instruments. And so, if Christ's birth is the dawn of a new saeculum, if his death on the cross and resurrection is the bright noonday declaring victory over darkness of the old saeculum of death and sin, then in a certain respect we need to not be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewal of our mind, in the word of St. Paul. And so that we might not be conformed to the old saeculum, but live within the mind of Christ, we see that his reign now begins, even through this humble sacrifice of ourselves, but it's completed in eternity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very powerful presentation of two things, I think. So the first is the fact that we all acknowledge that we are going through a profound crisis, contemporary crisis, and that contemporary crisis has a lot of facets or dimensions, but one of them is of a moral and philosophical or theological nature. And first of all, you have pointed out in your interpretation of the origins of this current situation that we are facing, the stages we got here using the concept of secularization step by step, getting us into this situation. The second thing that you pointed out was, again, a specific perspective of a way out of this crisis. So now, people participating in this conversation may disagree both with the diagnosis, how we got here, or they may disagree with the solution offered. But I think that all of us, we agree with one thing, that currently we are witnessing an extraordinary, unprecedented crisis of historical or meta-historical magnitudes. So I think that this is a very good starting point for a conversation, all of us converging on our assessment of the importance and the gravity of a diagnosis to this a crisis. And you have offered a working hypothesis and also a possible solution. So let's take the conversation to the next stage. And I have Professor Mircea Dumitru, as I have mentioned, our colleague at the University of Bucharest, and also the Vice President of the Romanian Academy of Arts and Sciences, building up, responding, and maybe asking some questions about what we have just heard. Professor Dumitru.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to be part of this dialogue. Let me point out for everybody that is the first time that I heard this presentation, marvelous presentation, very rich in ideas. So I'm going actually to react to something that you've said. I didn't have time to think thoroughly through all the arguments that you gave us. A few things about my background, since we didn't meet previously. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a law scholar. I'm coming from philosophy and especially logic. So in my heart, I'm a neo-Aristotelian, like Radu, my friend and colleague. And I share with that long tradition, which is also the historic and logical source of Thomism, a very strong realist view about many things, about truth, about facts, of nature at least, social facts. I'm a modicum of constructivist in some areas, but as I said, in my heart I am an relativist, and of course anti-constructivist in many fields. Now, that being said, I'm going to say a few words about the way actually I was struck by your arguments and make some short comments and raise some questions, and then I want to leave the discussion for the whole audience, especially so since in the audience I already saw some very distinguished theologians, a Catholic, Professor Dancă, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Bucharest. You may know him already, and also Professor Bunaccio, Neil Bunaccio, who is the Dean of the New Baptist faculty in our university. So they are in the position actually to say something which is maybe more substantive and relevant to the theological discourse that you gave us. But now, let me point out in the beginning a sort of ambiguity that I'm a logician, so forgive me for that. So, and you said that you studied with Polish theologians, and there is that great tradition in Poland between the two world wars in logic. And there is this kind of connection between logic and theology, especially with Thomism, that goes very well. So we have this topic, this big topic, secularization of the sources of morality. One way of looking at things is that whether or not we have one kind of or type of sources. And I'm going to emphasize at least two ways of looking at sources of something, in our case of morality. And then again, this is actually what occurred to me while I was attending to your lectures. The first comment actually was something that I thought about because I knew the title of your presentation, but I didn't know the content of your presentation. When you ask what are the reasons for this process, which might be inevitable, secularization of the sources of morality, does that mean necessarily that secularizing the sources we are going to end up with secularizing the morality, the ethics? It doesn't seem to me that it follows necessarily if we give this kind of phenomenology and actually sort out the various ways in which we secularize the sources of something, of morality in this case, and then we go directly to the idea that actually ethics is dead, at least from that classic perspective. And I'm going actually to say more about that because that could be very challenging for your perspective. Now about sources. The way, and that was perfectly okay for me, the way you put the things was more in this kind of historic tradition, this kind of concept, historic concept of the sources. And if we want to be more naturalist about that, we can say biological concept of a source. So my own source as an individual, as a biological entity, was a sperm and an egg. And my parents passed down on me some genetic features, okay? So by analogy, we can say that there are some sources, historic sources of morality, and if those sources are secular, then those secular features are going to be necessarily shared by the morality of the, 21st, 22nd, 23rd century. But there is another way of looking at the source of something. When you speak about epistemic authority, deontic authority, because we have reasons for action, we have reasons for knowledge. And at least from my own perspective, the classic concept of authority in knowledge or in action is something which goes beyond the domain which we evaluate or we assess. So for instance, in my own field in logic, there is some clear standards, which means that they are objective, they are not subjective. They are maybe intersubjective, but not subjective in the psychological sense. And when we assess pieces of reasoning, we go at that level which transcends the domain. Likewise for action. We have some properties of our actions, right actions, wrong actions, good actions, bad actions, and the standards are not intrinsic. The standards are somehow objectively independent from the field of the actions. One source of the crisis that Aligica mentioned, Professor Aligica mentioned, and actually pointed out that in your talk, is that, and I try to quote here, individuals by themselves are now allowed to judge according to their own quote-unquote standards. This is not a classic way of looking at things. And if we go down that road, we are going to end up with fragmentalization, relativism, all sorts of things that now we see that are extremely, extremely dangerous in contemporary society. So if we keep that distinction clear between the historical sources and this kind of more epistemic and wanting authority through which we evaluate and we assess contents of thought or actions, then it might be a case that the sources, the historical sources of current morality are secularized, but nevertheless there is a chance to keep ethics as strong, at least, as we used to have in the Aristotelian tradition, and to fight for that, because it's a very good fight to keep those kind of objective standards for the ethical discourse, even though we accept that we cannot talk about ethics in the 21st century as they did in the 4th century BC or in the 13th century with St. Thomas. So that is one issue, one point. I mean, separating sources and disambiguating the kinds of sources, and then looking at the secularization of the sources as being distinct from the secularization of the ethics or of the morals. And I'm going to end, when I'm going to end my intervention, I'm going to say a few words about some ethics in the 20th century which are not secularized by your own lights, but nevertheless are not religious either. Now, another issue which actually put the whole discussion in a broader perspective. It's very legitimate to speak about secularization in theological discourse, and that's the proper way of phrasing the things. However, in philosophy at least, in the 20th century, especially in the last part of the 20th century, let's say conventionally speaking from 1950s onwards, there has been this process that we called naturalization. And I mean, if you like, one of the fathers, one of the main historical sources of this kind of approach was Nietzsche. We may say that Nietzsche was the starting point of this postmodern approach, because roughly speaking, Nietzsche claimed, we don't have arguments in Nietzsche, we have metaphors, we have, I don't know, persuasive discourse, not pieces of reasonings. Anyhow, he has been very influential, and combining Nietzsche with neo-Marxism actually is what we've got today. Basically, Nietzsche says that there are no facts, there are only interpretations and perspectives. In other words, we cannot draw that classic distinction between questions of facts and questions of reason. Therefore, it's kind of illusory to speak about robust values, robust ethical norms through which we assess, we evaluate our lives. There are only habits. And as British empiricists put it, we are creatures of habits. There is a sort of self-emerging regularity, normativity in our actions, but there's nothing transcendent in that field, in that realm. About naturalization in philosophy, almost all the philosophers nowadays are naturalists. And the main dogma is that philosophy and science are on a continuum. Philosophy is somehow centrally located because the concepts, some of the metaphysical ideas and theses, epistemological theses, are pervasive, are part and parcel of every scientific discourse or practical discourse. Nevertheless, there is no distinct line. We cannot draw a hard line between science and philosophy. This started in America in the 20th century, especially with Willard Quine, who combined a bit of neo-positivism with pragmatism, and he actually put forward this holistic model according to which science and philosophy are on this continuum. The result of this way of understanding philosophy was to say that there is no distinction between the question that we raise and the models that we build in philosophy and what scientists are doing. Therefore, if the methods of scientists cannot be applied to some issues like values, norms, ideals, emotions, and so on and so forth, those are not scientific issues and they are not important to study. Therefore, humanities in general are not important or as important as they used to be in the academia. And that's one source, one political and cultural source of the crisis of the humanities in the academia today, with the exception of law, which is also a practical issue and very important for practical and political life, and law does not share this fate with the other humanities, with history, literary studies, philosophy, in the way that we do philosophy in the Western tradition, at least. I believe that secularization is one aspect of this naturalization of the sciences in general. And then the task that we can set for ourselves is how to argue and how to fight the good fight against this kind of naturalism. The good news is that there has been, and there still are some philosophers, Wittgenstein was one of them, who resisted naturalism. There are some other philosophers, living philosophers, who have good arguments against naturalism. And just to wrap up and to finish my intervention, in ethics, we have various brands of ethics which are not religious ethics. They are declared by the ethicists as not being religious ethics, so the historic sources are not in religion, but nevertheless, they are not secular in the sense that you mentioned. And I can actually just mention here one towering figure, Oxford professor Derek Parfit, who worked for this kind of ethics to save the ethics from relativism, regardless of the fact that he himself had some religious views. He continued a tradition starting from Kant and from utilitarianism, and he gave a marvelous work in ethics, which is not secular, but nevertheless has very, very weak connections with the religious discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dumitru. I am going to probably be a little bit unjust with the complexity of the argument, but I think just to be on the same page, everybody, with where we are with the conversation, I think that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the challenge is this. Professor Dumitru says, Father Ezra, you are putting a lot of explanatory power and expectations from the secularization thesis. We have replaced a certain way of building our morality on religion with a way of building morality on reason. But Professor Dumitru says, how about the situation in which the current crisis, which you are diagnosing based on the secularization thesis, might be actually the result of us not being smart enough to build up a morality on reason. So it's just a technical flaw in our execution of building up a morality on reason, as opposed to a structural flaw to any kind of morality which is based on reason. Right? So,
one of the elements of Thomas Aquinas' synthesis was this ability to give a commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and to see the independent insight of reason operating without revelation whatsoever. And yet at the same time to see how this can also be incorporated into a theological view. When we get to the separation of these two elements, you can see one of two extremes. Either a sort of theocracy which wants to rule by the Bible alone, or you have a pure reason scientism, I'd call it scientism, which argues that reason cannot transcend itself with any divine revelation, and so it descends into eventually first historical materialism, and then it descends into actually denying reason's own power. Because when reason starts to find the limits of its ability to explain human nature or even mathematics, there's going to be a limit even to how much can mathematics recognize within its own limited sphere, right? This is part of the Gödel's theorem, is that math cannot prove itself. And so you have to have philosophy to come in and to provide some of the theorems that are necessary in order to abstract from material, where you start to get mathematics. So what I would suggest is it's true that some elements of what I would call, say, the theocratic model are certainly inadequate on their own, because you don't find all elements of truth, all elements of law or ethics solely within, say, sacred scripture or even within the church fathers. This is inadequate on its own to provide a grounding for humanity. This is precisely why I was glad that it was mentioned. The pillars are Greek philosophy, Roman law, as well as Christianity. And so each of those, in a way, has been united within the Christian Western growth for centuries, and now one or the other starts to shift in light of different challenges. Because even though, in a certain way, as you say, law itself is more immune from the destruction that we see among the humanities, what happens, though, it becomes a technocratic adjustment of human power. And people are no longer interested in inculcating virtue, as Aristotle says in the Politics, that one of the purposes of law is to inculcate virtue in the people. Once you no longer believe that virtue is possible, you use law simply to penalize your enemies, and then you don't practice law justly with respect to your friends. And so this is what Schmitt says is now the current situation of law, namely it's a friend-enemy distinction, which is actually irrational, because sometimes your friends need to be justly punished, and sometimes your enemies need to be defended.
Would natural law be an antidote to this kind of development?
Yes, so the question was whether natural law would be an antidote to the developments outlined by Father Ezra.
Yes, so I was very happy that you distinguished between historical sources of morality and epistemic. In a way, my talk was very anti-Thomistic insofar as my approach was historical, and he would have had an analytic approach, in fact. Probably your analytic presentation would have harmonized with his approach much better methodologically. I find that the answer of natural law helps us to grasp what is true about human nature universally, even abstracting from culture or abstracting from, say, genetic inheritance. It allows us to see human nature on its broadest scale. And this is where law ought to reside, not just with respect to individuals, but also not so abstract as to be, well, God is always good, and so we just have to contemplate the divine mystery, but that doesn't help us to know how to determine whether the thief is guilty, right? So you have sort of the divine eternal mysteries, and then you have the concrete issues, and natural law actually provides a middle way to grasp these things by reason, and then to try to harmonize between the eternal abstract and then the particular concrete.
Thank you. So we are going to Professor Rizzoli with his next question, but still I'm going to press you a little bit further on this. And again, thinking in terms of me and my students. So our question is this. You're talking about, or we are talking here about an ethics based on reason alone. In what measure me and my students who are thinking that this kind of project is possible, we could still be pursuing this project, also be moral or ethical persons?
I would not advocate, actually, for an ethics by reason alone. In fact...
No, I know that you are not advocating, but let's say that we are trying to think in terms of building up our ethical positions. We want to be ethical persons, and we are thinking that trying to build up our ethical positions by using reason and science. And we are very honest people with ourselves and with our friends and community and so on and so forth. And for us, the challenge listening you is whether or not us being honestly involved in this project of building up our ethical position and social position on reason alone is making us unethical persons.
Well, so I think one of the ways that ethics can be helped by theology, for instance, is because there does have to be independence, right, within a certain respect, and we don't expect the church to, say, legislate for the political sphere, and we do have to pursue sciences within their own proper logic, that they have their own methodology, their own first principles, and so on. But especially with ethics, one way in which when reason alone operates without, say, theology, is sometimes you can come to an incorrect conclusion, and theology can say, well, actually human dignity transcends your particular cultural understanding. And so it can provide a guide rail in this way, where if ethics now, people this postmodern way, they deny even biology as a source to understand how humans ought to operate in union with each other. And so theology can say, but biology is always present. So it can actually reaffirm the power of reason when reason itself becomes uncertain. And then on the other hand, there are other ways in which theology can enter in to help to show the transcendent teleology of human ethics, that it goes beyond simply trying to adjust things for some economic or political good, that humans themselves have a trajectory of dignity that lasts into eternity. And sometimes reason alone has difficulty recognizing this. And so when the horizon is lowered, then that can start to become, once again, only power relations. And so ethics by itself has its proper sphere, but can be corrected within this larger perspective.
Professor.
Yeah, just a short sequel on that, because I might have been misunderstood in the way I phrase my position. I don't think that the right way of dividing up the space of possibilities here is to say that we have a rational ethics as opposed to a religious or theological ethics. Because I find, especially in Thomism, which is essentially a religious ethics, a lot of rationalism, post-Aristotelian rationalism. I didn't mention two projects which come from this naturalist tradition in the 20th century, which is cognitive science and evolutionary studies. So there are now attempts to give foundations to ethics coming from that perspective, cognitive science of evolution. I don't find that very appealing, even though those are quote-unquote scientific approaches to ethics. But I still find that there is a space for reasoning, rational ethics, maybe combined with bits of current days theology, rational theology, and we can thereby avoid the pitfalls of this kind of secularization or naturalization. So that actually is the way I picture and actually I draw the map of the discussion.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I'm the one who is driving sharp edges here. So these two gentlemen are closer in their positions than the position that I'm putting forward. And I'm going to press you again on that, and I will go to Professor Rizzolio. So you are saying that the reason should be corrected by theology. But then the question is, what theology? Or, let me put it differently, reason should be corrected by religion. What religion? Any religion? Any theology?
One of the things that distinguishes between what I would call a purely rational ethics versus a purely theological ethics is what are the starting points of the argument? What are the first premises that are unquestioned? And for theology, the first premises are divine revelation. So for instance, you have the Ten Commandments. These things are unquestionable. Whereas the first starting points for a rational ethics, it depends on the philosopher. It could be epistemic values. It could be, as you say, cognitive neuroscience. And so the grounds can be rather uncertain. With regard to the question, well, what should be the first premises of theological ethics? Certainly, I don't think that there's such a thing as religion in general. This sort of deist view is actually contrary to the claims of the religions themselves, where, for instance, if you have Islam versus Christianity, they disagree about whether Christ is God or whether Christ is just a prophet, of whom Muhammad is the greater prophet. And so you can't have an ethics that's based on the Quran and expect it to be entirely the same as ethics that's based, say, on sacred scripture and Christian tradition. So then the question of well, which religion ought to be that which is seen as a potential corrector to natural ethics, then I would say, well, it has to be the religion that is true. And this gets into theological questions. How do we know which religion is true? Is there a way to adjudicate among religions? And these questions. So certainly I didn't provide any foundation for answering those questions, but I would say if you go to India and you see the difference between the Hindu foundations of their legal tradition and the Islamic traditions, they are in contrast to one another. So this isn't simply a Western problem.
Yeah, so that was precisely my point, to point out that our conversation is part of a huge, larger, not only conversation, but intellectual, spiritual, and existential a challenge to humanity. And it only happens that in our days we are the witnesses of this profound crisis, which forces us again to the forefront of everything that we are doing and the way we are facing the future, these kind of problems, which are much profound than simply a political reform or a governance reform or a reform of the economic systems. Professor Rizoiu, and then we open up for questions and comments from the public.
I'll just tackle very briefly on one point that caught my attention in your wonderful speech. So you mentioned at one point in the middle of the speech the relation between the oppressor and the oppressed. And I think that this kind of defining antagonic classes, okay, I'm not speaking about heresy here, of defining good and evil, of two clashing equally equal powers. But maybe there is something in there. Maybe we should try to understand that the world does not work like this. And this is one of the premises of the historical materialism, for example. The entire history of humankind is a clash between classes. There is an oppressor and an oppressed, okay? But maybe it's not like this. Maybe the humankind is prone to diversity. Maybe this was the divine design, that humans should be different. Humans should be individuals. They should not be masses with no specific traits whatsoever, but with an amalgamated will. And if we admit that instead of thinking in dualist notions, and we see today that social networks are accused expressly in accelerating this dualistic division. It's our friends and the others which are the enemies, and that's it. And nobody listens to the others. Maybe if we start from the axiom of diversity, and even the Jesus parables in the Gospels, they are puzzling because the examples he is giving are contradictory to the common sense. And then at the end he says, you cannot understand this because you are not in you don't have the knowledge that I have. But please trust me that this is the way. So basically, Jesus himself says you don't need to think in patterns, in very simple patterns like the good guys and the bad guys. Accepting diversity So accepting that humanity is made out of multiple individuals, or even multiple smaller groups, let's say, which are complementing each other. Because this is the idea, this is the force of human, now going to anthropology and biology. This is the way we become the apex predator. We are not the strongest animal, we are not the largest animal, but we can cooperate with each other, and the group forms a formidable predator. Well, then, instead of defining good actions, maybe we should focus on good values. You mentioned the Ten Commandments, for example. Jesus said, forget about the Ten Commandments. Yeah, okay, St. Paul tells us this. Forget about the Ten Commandments. Those are only particular aspects of a larger design. And eventually you can replace them with one commandment. Think to the other one like yourself. So respect the identity of the other one. Respect the alterity like you respect yourself. Well, then maybe we should start, instead of defining ethics like a list of commandments, you should do that, you shouldn't do that, we put some values in there, and then the particular actions will be judged on a particular scale. What I suggest here is that instead of asking the state, please protect against the oppressor, we are the oppressed, we might ask the state, please make a system of justice, in lack of a better word, and once I consider in a particular situation I was not treated fairly, then that instance will look into the particular facts and decide you are treated fairly or you are not treated fairly. I don't know, it's just a thought, I didn't develop on it,
It's a lot of interesting stuff on the table, so you pick up one of the, or two of the issues, and then we open up to the public. So please.
Well, one thing that the ancient Romans had when they developed their laws, remember at first, the only written laws were small enough to fit on a single, exactly, the 12 tables. And one of the reasons why, I think, is that when you have just men, then the justice is instantiated. This is virtue, is the just person can then judge justly for the concrete situation. When justice is less present, you need to externalize the justice in larger written codes, because people then, they do not trust that the judge will actually judge justly. They think it will be arbitrary. And so you have to multiply the number of caveats and particular situations to ensure that the judge will have as little power as possible to make an arbitrary decision. And so the idea of, say, the two commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, well, if everything is summed up within those, well, the less you love God or the less you love your neighbor, the more you need to have specifications of what does it mean to respect my neighbor, what does it mean to respect the natural law, and so on. So I would in a way agree that Christ summed up the Ten Commandments there, but maybe he didn't throw them out. He said the Ten Commandments are logical ramifications of these commandments. Yeah.
Thank you. So where are we at this point? So we are in time. As I have mentioned, it might be the case that we are going to overtime for a little bit. So let's say 15 minutes, maybe a couple of minutes more, a couple of minutes less. So based on my account, again, we have time for 3, 4, maybe 5 questions in function of how focused we are when we are formulating those questions. So that being said, Professor Bunacio.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation and for the wonderful discussion. As a theologian, you don't often hear in the University of Bucharest theological debates, so I welcome that. So welcome also to our university. I'm from a Baptist perspective, so I'm a Protestant. So, and my perspective is shaped a little bit by Karl Barth's theology. And he says in one point that religion is very common to human beings, but it doesn't generate faith. So I would make a distinction between religion, as what Dietrich Bonhoeffer says is the clothing of faith, and faith itself. And therefore, for me, secularization as a process is not necessarily something bad. It's returning to the seculum what belongs to the seculum. As Harvey Cox, the theologian from Harvard, says, the first act of secularization is the story of creation, where all these people who had multiple deities hear that there is only one God, and He creates. So that's a kind of story of secularization which appears in Genesis in the scripture. This is the background. I have two remarks here, and maybe they come out as a question. I think that part of the problem for us is our difficulty in finding an adequate language about God. I think somehow philosophy has, I wouldn't say hijacked, because philosophy has been a tool for theologians to develop language about God. But this idea coming from Aristotle, talking about substance, or for Plato about forms, have also generated a language about God being static. And therefore we expect a static world, and we expect a natural law that waits to be discovered. But then we struggle how to discover this natural law. So I wonder if this very transcendent understanding of God is not leading us to giving reason, which is very important, and we use it in science. I'm an engineer at origin, so I'm not against reason. We give reason an absolute power sometimes. So when it comes to ethical questions, the real question for me is, who has the authority for good and bad? Karl Barth has a very interesting example, which I think may resonate with students and staff here at the law faculty. He has this image of a child going into a court of law. The court of law is empty. The child goes and sees the seat of the judge. He goes on the seat. He is very happy. He sees the hammer, and he starts hitting the hammer and judging and making decisions. Well, he has no authority. How does our ethics have authority? So I think if we move to a more immanentist view of God, in which God is part of creation, which is part of theological thinking, but in which we don't see God as kind of controlling creation, but God giving purpose and fulfilling His purpose through covenant. You know, the real crisis of the world, from a theological point of view, is what Jesus says: the judgment of this world has come. So with the coming of Jesus Christ, I'm talking as a theologian, the judgment is the very presence of Jesus Christ, who judges us for who we are. It's like, so really the authority is there. So my question is, can we develop, and because I heard what you said about the role of theology. I'm more proclaiming the role of theology, but I think it's a real question if we want to relate to our world. Can we give faith a public space, not in political issues, which happens in North America, and it tries to be imported here, in issue politics, which divides people, in nationalism, but in the idea of being a witness to the purpose of God for this world, a God who is involved through Jesus Christ and who is involved in the processes of this world. So I'm more of a process person here rather than of a substance person. Thank you.
Aristotle says that God is pure act, and pure act is in fact not static, but it's most active. Whereas all of us have some participation, that we are finite beings who cannot exist on our own. And so God, being the absolute of being, means that he's not constrained by any of the limitations which creatures have. We have limited understanding, we have limited power, we have limited even grasp of God. So God, on the other hand, has this all-encompassing, as you say, he's both immanent as well as transcendent. The element, I appreciate that you're emphasizing God's immanence within creation and within our own political sphere, is in a certain way to separate them too much is to overlook how the essence of each thing has within itself a divine intelligibility. And divine intelligibility, I mean that not that we are all somehow God and just God hidden or manifest in different ways, but rather that the intelligibility was not created by ourselves. So it's not a self-creation. And to say that we don't create ourselves also means that we don't determine ourselves in every respect. Although there can be too much of an influence of religion and politics, it's very striking that in the Western world, they would often refer to first principles of law from sacred scripture, for instance. And you can even see, as of very recently in the United States, they would refer to scripture as a common moral element. They would say, this is what scripture says about human dignity. Or because of the fact that humans have been made in the image of God, we have to respect life. These kinds of essential elements. And so I would say that now that the whole question of God's existence is thrown into the face of politics, we now are no longer certain of the grounding, even of authority whatsoever. So I would certainly agree that on the one question we have the theological question, how does God relate to nature? And that informs our understanding of how nature operates. And then on the other hand, the question of authority is absolutely crucial. And in fact, this is one of the elements that St. Paul says. He says, all human authority eventually finds its power from God. So a purely atheistic state.
Yeah, but when Paul talks and Jesus talks about God's power and involvement, it's defined by one word: love. The way God acts is in love, not in control. That's why Paul says people look for power, some people look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified because that's where we see God at work. So.
Yeah, so love is not separate from reason either. It's not love as abstracted from intelligibility. These go together. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question, another question. Professor Duncan.
Thank you very much, Father Ezra, for your presentation. I am familiar with your approach to this phenomenon, very complicated, because we have to speak about secularization in Europe and America, and a different secularization in Asia or in South America, different aspects of secularization. But moving ahead a little bit with optimistic approach, like St. Thomas, can you identify behind this secularization in Europe some aspects which invites us to be more Christian, more faithful to values, Christian values, and which kind of values we need today to face secularization? That is my question.
One of the elements I think we see in modern trends, for instance, and this goes to this question, is everything negative? No. Can we return to the Middle Ages? No. There's always the moving forward of time, and we cannot find grounding fully in the past because there are always new questions that arise. One of the elements we can say, not so much of secularization, but of the present moment, is on the one hand, there's the loss of the individual self with social media, and this is a major problem. It makes propaganda actually much more effective. It's actually astonishing how people can adopt an opinion very, very quickly. But on the other hand, this means, too, that people can access the truth more quickly as well. And so I'm certainly no Luddite in the sense that having this idea that technology is evil, we need to return to the 19th century. If we can just have no electricity, then things would be working out. Actually, when people had no electricity, it still led to all these other conclusions. So the technological sphere, for me, is actually not a problematic sphere. And although every new technology brings new dangers, Plato talked about this when he speaks about the dangers of writing. Remember, he gives the example of the Egyptians worrying about writing, and he says, if they have writing, then they will forget. Their memories will start to no longer be present to the reality. But of course, we don't now, for that reason, remove writing or have monuments that are simply hieroglyphics. And so likewise, we have questions of social media technology, which have a great power to bring people to see truth that they no longer were perhaps able to see before. This is one of the reasons why radio, for instance, during the communist time was very effective, is it gave people access to knowledge that the government could not control. And so for me, these are positive. Now, are there positive values as well? I would say one of the continual tensions between the individual and the individual dignity, and then the communal and our unification with people on the level of humanity. I think people more readily recognize now than perhaps even earlier that there's a common human nature that is spread throughout the world, that it's not simply my culture which is superior to all others. This doesn't mean cultural relativism, because you can still have subsidiarity. Cultures recognize differences without needing to make those differences hierarchical. Is this culture better because it has, this kind of soup? This culture better because de gustibus non disputandum. This is a difference. It's not a moral value. But a larger moral value is to say we respect all people because we have human nature. And therefore, there's some things that are contrary to human nature that always ought to be disallowed. And that, I think, is a very positive thing. So if we are able then to keep this notion of global human nature in common, but then now also to reaffirm the dignity of the individual and to reaffirm human liberty, then these two things don't have to be inimical. There'll be tensions, but they don't have to be in competition.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So we have time only for one tiny question, if there is in the audience. Okay, Robert, tiny question, which means brief.
Okay, thank you very much. A very small question. Regarding the future, do you see the future in a pessimistic or optimistic way?
Well, I would say pessimistic for the short term, optimistic for the long term.
Well, that was an excellent yes. Yeah.
If you truly believe in that, you've got to be optimistic.
So that was an excellent question for setting up the last moment of our conversation. As I have mentioned, or maybe I haven't mentioned that, but I'm a professor of governance, institutional design, and I mentioned at the beginning would have a two-tiered system. On the one hand, I'm keeping the time and trying to keep things under the 1 hour and the 40 minutes thing. On the other hand, I have Professor Stoica, who is looking at me and he's disapproving the fact that we are going more than the 1 hour 45 minutes. So I'm going to say one thing about the future, and I'm going to say that to the students, because what you have seen here is basically the conversation of the future. Maybe it won't be the conversation in these specific terms and language. As Professor Bunaciu has mentioned, we need maybe a new language to identify, define, and engage these things. Maybe there should be a continuity and discontinuity as well, because the old ways of approaching things. But definitely this is the conversation of the future. And this is the conversation of the future also in academic settings. And this is precisely because I think currently we are reaching the final stage of this process in which reason, rationality, instrumental rationality, via the cybernetic revolution, via artificial intelligence and digitalization, it's reaching an ending point. And beyond this, there is nothing to be explored and further articulated. We have reached the ending point. We have to return to these issues, to these problems. We have to learn again how to re-engage them. We have to learn again the languages, or to reinvent the languages of the 21st century in order to engage with these dimensions, because these are the dimensions which make us human. We have lost everything at this point. In the moment in which you have an artificial intelligence, we have lost almost everything that what makes us human, which we are continuing to define our ways of being and our nature in the old paradigms. So this is why we have started this conversation at the University of Bucharest. This is why we have created these institutional vehicles, which you are seeing that are becoming stronger, are becoming more articulated, and this is why we are trying to integrate the conversation which is happening in Romania and in Romanian language, and this is a bridge towards it, even if it's happening to be in the lingua franca of the moment, which is English, because we know that this is the future. So this is the conversation of the future. This is not about the Middle Ages, this is not about the Reformation, this is not about the 19th century, this is about the future. We are at the very beginning, we are trying to find our ways, maybe we are able to capture everything that other previous generations have already prepared for us. So this is why we are here, trying to engage in these things, but again, this is the future. So again, it was a real pleasure and a privilege of having all of you here. I know that also we have a lot of people, or some people online, I don't know about that, I just wanted to thank them for their interest. And we are promising to continue this conversation, we're promising to have us engage even more with a network of organizations and people who are thinking about the future without forgetting the past, who are thinking about the seculum without forgetting about the transcendent. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon at our next event. Goodbye.